We'll get to that. But Bruning's, also appreciated the value of bimanual laryngoscopy. Selleck comes along in 1961, and this became lore. And for many years, we have taught that cricoid pressure was the linchpin of safety in emergency airway management. Are you guys still doing cricoid? Gone. Beautiful thing. So I've been advocating this for a decade. In 2011, the ACLS guidelines just changed. And the irony of this is we had this very misguided anatomic notion that we could compress the esophagus by pressing on the cricoid. And it seemed to make sense, and that's why it was kind of this sticky notion, and it caught on. By the way, Selleck's original photo does not include the fig newtons, but they are heavy cookies. And for those of you who know, you're supposed to do 44 newtons, which is about 10 pounds. But Selleck said extreme atlanto-occipital extension, head lower than the chest. So, there was actually a obstetrician here Mendelssohn, who first described this whole business of, in anesthesiology and obstetrics. It was out of Sinai. Aspiration syndrome was first described. But they were using incredible volumes of air. So everybody vomited. And because everybody vomited, they actually suggested that you hold the patient's head down so the vomit could run out. Imagine trying to ventilate people in a head-down position. But that's what they recommended. And extreme atlanto-occipital extension, which actually doesn't open the airway. What's interesting is now, with modern imaging, we know that airway compression with cricoid pressure occurs 81% of the time. And in 90% of the time, the esophagus actually moves lateral to the cricoid. And a picture's worth 1,000 words. But here we have the cricoid ring. Here we have the esophagus. This is the vertebral body. Pressure is applied here, and look what happens. The esophagus moves to the side. So although this was a very sticky concept that for many years was deemed to be the linchpin of safety, we now look back on it and go, yeah, that was stupid. And I can be at a grand rounds at a major academic center, and I can say, do you guys do cricoid pressure? And you're like, nah. I can tell you, 5 years ago, I went to Yale, and I suggested this concept. And the chairman, after my talk, said, I just want to make a formal announcement that we're still doing cricoid pressure. But yeah, they're late to the game anyway. But it's just sort of a fascinating thing how if you stay around in emergency medicine, a lot of what you were taught as religious, and you have to do this, wait 10 years, wait 20 years, you look back, yeah, that was stupid, don't do that. I think about ice lavage, rotating tourniquets. Some of these things, you young folks would go, huh? But in the day, it was considered, holy activities to be doing those things. So here we have cricoid pressure collapsing the airway, and 86% of men and 100% of women have difficult ventilation. So it's just ironic how things change. Here we have cricoid pressure with and without an oral airway, causing decreases in tidal volumes and an increase in peak inspiratory pressure. My belief is that the key to preventing aspiration is not pressing on the neck, but it is rather proper ventilation at low volume, low pressure, and head elevation so gravity is on your side. And we'll talk about my iridosternal notch, which is, I think, a key way to think about proper positioning. But a wonderful article by Dan Ellis in 2007 in Annals reviewed this whole cricoid pressure stuff, but it's never been validated. Aspiration occurs despite it. The imaging has kind of disproved it, and it prevents tube delivery. And it actually, in awake volunteers or in the OR before induction, if you press on the cricoid ring, it triggers vomiting, which is sort of an interesting phenomenon. And then the real reason why cricoid pressure, I think, will go away and we'll look back as, yeah, that was stupid, is because of its effect on the laryngeal mask airway. So the LMA is this wedge-shaped device that pops not into the larynx. It goes behind the larynx. It wedges in the upper esophagus. When you press on the cricoid ring, you actually push it out of position. And that has become our default rescue ventilation device. So I'm a fan of bimanual laryngoscopy, which is not cricoid pressure, and it is not backward, upward, rightward pressure. This is your hand and your eye connected, optimizing view, pressure on the thyroid cartilage by and large. And after the image is optimized, you can hand off and have an assistant. But it works through two different mechanisms. One mechanism it works through is pressure on the underlying hyoepiglottic ligaments So you improve the mechanics because basically you're driving the tip of this blade into the vallecula. And it's kind of like a key fitting into a lock. If you're here and you're pressing with a lot of work and it's not lifting, and then you get into this sweet spot and boom, it opens. And the same thing happens. And you guys in New York are familiar with locks. You probably all got Medicos or those doubly sided whatever. But if you're halfway into the lock and you can't turn the door, you know exactly that it just doesn't work. And then boom, the last piece goes in and then the lock opens. And that's exactly how I view curved blade laryngoscopy. You have to be in that sweet spot with the tip fully advanced into the vallecula so you can turn the lock, lift the epiglottis. But the other reason why it works is it presses down on the thyroid and you actually are lowering the airway into the operator's line of sight. So here we have imaging with my camera just showing this dropping down the larynx and elevating the epiglottis with a curved blade. And this is with a Goodell blade. Goodell, in case you don't know, was actually a fascinating guy. He had a dog whose name was Airway, and he pioneered cuff tracheal tubes. And to demonstrate the efficacy of cuff tracheal tubes, he would ketamize his poor animal and submerge him in a fish tank in front of audiences and wake him up at the end of the presentation after hooking him up to a ventilator. You know, and I got a little white cotton fluff ball myself, and I think my wife and kids would kill me if I did that to Nora dog. But anyway, here we have the Goodell blade, which is a straight blade. So we're lifting the epiglottis directly in these images, but we have managed to still posteriorly displace the larynx to improve laryngeal view. Under fluoro, I have some wonderful images from my friends in Canada, in Halifax, by George Kovach. If you haven't been to Halifax, I highly recommend it. Here's the hyoid, here's the epiglottis, but watch what happens. A hand's going to come along, in this case an assistant. I would recommend you do this yourself with your right hand. But notice how mobile the larynx is, and then we're going to see a tracheal tube, the thin opaque line of the tracheal tube come down, and in the words of Bill Murray, it's in the hole. But there is a nice fluoro images. So let's take a look at a couple of examples of bimanual laryngoscopy. And what I think many people don't appreciate is laryngoscopy, whether this is with direct or with video, is a procedure of subtlety. Minor changes in force, tip, location of the blade is going to cause major difference in laryngeal exposure. So we have the edge of the epiglottis, we have the posterior cartilages and the notch. Watch the right hand, here it comes, and we drop the cords down into view. We have a little bit of tongue here, but not much of a problem. In this case, which I think is true in about 10% of cases, when we let go, the larynx sort of just popped up and we lost the view. Then an assistant comes along, now an assistant is holding it, and we go for the tube. But let's take another look at bimanual. One of the things that bimanual laryngoscopy affords is the ability to move the larynx in a side-to-side direction. And what that does is it lets you recognize the posterior cartilages as this vertical cleft. So we have the epiglottis, and then we're going to get a bump. And the question is, what is that bump? And Jackson talks about this, that, you know, with training, you know, you will recognize the right posterior cartilage, which is what that is, from the left. So watch, as we do our bimanual, there's a bump notch, cuneiform corniculate. Here's the interarytenoid notch, that thin vertical cleft. And the tube is going underneath the epiglottis, but over the posterior cartilage into the trachea. So in the most difficult airways, we're going to get an exposure of only the posterior structures, but that is our dividing line. If you go south of the interarytenoid notch, you're in Jersey. You go north, you know, across the Hudson, or not, well, east, you know, but you know what I'm saying. It's the dividing line between Manhattan and Jersey there. It's the interarytenoid notch. But I did this cadaver study, 1,500 laryngoscopies over a year with 100 operators, and what we found basically was when the operator manipulates the larynx themselves, that's the best way to improve laryngeal exposure. I mentioned to you already the new ACLS guidelines, which I was very happy to see. A guy at Penn by the name of Bob Newmar was very involved in these, and I've been working on Bob for a decade, telling him, yeah, dump that cricoid pressure thing. And finally, there's become this abundance of evidence, and actually most of the major journals have now been publishing review articles questioning the whole cricoid pressure thing.